Europe in the 11th century was nothing like today's. It was a continent carved into feudal domains where borders shifted with every war or marriage. Society stood on a strict hierarchy, a stone pyramid no one dared to shake. At its base were peasants, 9 out of 10 people whose lives revolved around the land. They rose at dawn, grabbing plow or sickle to till fields, sow seeds, mow hay, or mend fences under blazing sun or rain. Their homes were humble, mud and straw huts with thatched roofs that leaked in storms. Inside, a dirt floor, a couple of benches, a smoky hearth without a chimney, perhaps a rough table if fortune smiled. Their food was plain: coarse rye or barley bread, oat or millet porridge, vegetables like onions, cabbage, or turnips. Meat was rare, saved for festivals like Christmas or Easter, when the Lord might allow a pig or chicken to be slaughtered. Fish from a nearby river or pond was a luxury, but not every village had access to water. Hunger loomed always. A poor harvest, drought, or locust swarm could destroy a year's work, leaving families with empty stores for winter. Most peasants were serfs, bound to the land like slaves. They couldn't leave their village without the Lord's permission, as they belonged to him along with the fields. The Lord demanded labor, days spent working his lands for free, and taxes, a tenth of the harvest for the church, a share of grain or livestock for himself, fees for marriages, births, or deaths. In good years, a peasant might hide some grain to survive the cold. In bad years, hunger was a cruel companion, and debts to the Lord grew heavy. History recalls revolts like the Jacquerie of 1358 in France, where desperate peasants burned castles and killed nobles. But in the 11th century, such uprisings were rare. Serfs endured, knowing no other life. Higher up the pyramid were cities, cramped, noisy, and dirty, yet pulsing with life. Narrow streets paved with stone or mired in mud echoed with labor. Blacksmiths hammered anvils, potters spun clay, weavers worked looms to craft cloth for the wealthy. Markets were the city's heart, alive with trade: bread, cheese, pottery, sometimes exotic spices or silk brought by merchants from far-off lands. Unlike peasants, craftsmen and traders were free. They formed guilds, associations of smiths, weavers, or bakers, which set prices, ensured quality, and trained apprentices. Cities like Genoa, Venice, or Bruges became trade hubs where wealth flowed freely. Here, a new class, the bourgeoisie, took root, townsfolk who could buy land, influence, or even titles. But city life was harsh. Plagues, fires, and street brawls were common. Cities built walls for defense, and their militias armed themselves, soon with a weapon that would change everything: the crossbow. Above the cities stood knights, the stars of the medieval world. A knight wasn't just a warrior. He was a symbol of honor, strength, and prestige. From age 7, a noble boy was sent to a lord's castle as a page, learning to ride horses, shoot bows, wield swords, and handle lances. By 14, he became a squire, tending to his lord's horse and armor, and at 21, he was knighted in a solemn ceremony with prayers and a symbolic sword tap on the shoulder. Armor was costly. A chainmail hauberk with thousands of iron rings, a helmet with a visor, a sturdy wooden shield covered in leather, a tempered steel sword, all worth more than several villages with their huts and cows. The war horse, bred for battle, was like a modern tank: swift, strong, expensive. On the battlefield, a knight was a fearsome force. His mounted charge, lance forward, scattered infantry like leaves in a storm. The chivalric code, bravery, loyalty, protection of the weak, was celebrated in troubadour ballads like the Song of Roland. But reality was grimmer. Knights raided villages, waged private wars, and their tournaments were bloody spectacles with broken bones and deaths. A knight in chainmail or early plate armor was nearly invincible until the crossbow arrived. Higher still were the nobles, barons, counts, dukes, whose lands spanned dozens of miles. They collected taxes, judged their subjects, and raised armies. The king stood at the pyramid's peak, but his power was fragile. In 11th century France, the Capetian kings relied on their vassals, while in England, after the Norman conquest of 1066, William the Conqueror ruled with an iron fist, but still needed to negotiate with barons. Above all loomed the church, a force none could ignore. It owned a third of Europe's land, collected a tithe, a tenth of every harvest or income, and ran its own courts where bishops settled disputes. The Pope could excommunicate a king, as Gregory VII did to Emperor Henry IV in 1077, forcing him to kneel in the snow at Canossa. Bishops and abbots were not just spiritual leaders, but feudal lords with castles, armies, and treasures. Into this rigid world burst the crossbow, a weapon that broke all the rules. Its history stretches back to antiquity. In China, crossbows were used as early as the 4th century, as in the Battle of Maling in 341, where infantry fired bolts from a distance. In Greece, the 4th century gastrophetes, or belly bow, was a bulky device operated by multiple soldiers. Rome had its scorpions, similar contraptions, but in Europe, the crossbow was reborn around 950 CE as a hunting tool, becoming widespread by the 11th and 12th centuries. Likely introduced from Byzantium or southern Italy, where Arabs and Greeks used similar designs, it spread across the continent like wildfire after crusaders employed it against Saracens in the First Crusade of 1096 to 1099. Why was the crossbow revolutionary? First, simplicity. Becoming an archer required years of training, strength, and skill to draw a bow and hold it steady. A crossbow could be loaded by anyone. Early models were cocked by hand or foot with a hook, while later ones by the 14th century used mechanical devices like the goat's foot lever, crank, or windlass. A novice could learn to shoot in days. Second, power. A bolt, a short, heavy arrow with a metal tip, flew 300 to 400 meters and pierced chainmail at 100 meters. By the 13th century, crossbows with steel bows could punch through early plate armor. Third, accuracy. A crossbow stayed aimed without effort, letting the shooter take careful aim. Fourth, accessibility. Though more expensive than a simple bow, it was far cheaper than a war horse or knight's armor. In cities like Genoa or Florence, smiths churned out crossbows by the hundreds, arming urban militias to defend their walls. But it had drawbacks. Reloading took 2 to 3 minutes for powerful models. Unlike a longbow firing 10 to 12 arrows a minute, crossbows were heavier and bolts cost more than arrows. Yet these flaws paled beside its effectiveness. The crossbow transformed warfare. Before it, battles hinged on cavalry. Knights charged, slicing through infantry. Foot soldiers, often peasants with pitchforks or spears, were fodder. The crossbow shifted the balance. In sieges, like Antioch in 1098, crossbowmen fired from walls, killing engineers or riders approaching the gates. In open battles, they formed ranks behind pavises, large shields that covered them while reloading, and halted cavalry charges. In the Crusades, crossbows were terrifying. At Acre in 1191, Richard the Lionheart's crusaders shot while marching, covering 50 miles under Saladin's attacks. At Mansoura in 1250, French crossbowmen saved Louis IX by repelling a Muslim assault with a barrage of bolts. Even at Crécy in 1346, where Genoese crossbowmen lost to English longbowmen due to rain-soaked strings and no pavises, their presence showed the weapon's reach. The church saw the crossbow as a threat to the social order. A commoner with a crossbow could kill a knight, the symbol of nobility. This struck at society's core. In 1139, at the Second Lateran Council, Pope Innocent II banned crossbows and bows in wars between Christians, calling them diabolical and threatening excommunication. The ban was reaffirmed by Innocent III in 1205 and even appeared in England's Magna Carta of 1215. Why? The crossbow undermined the chivalric code, allowing kills from afar without a duel. But the ban was hypocritical. Crossbows were allowed against infidels in the Crusades, and in Europe, everyone used them: French, Germans, Italians. For example, at Legnano in 1176, Italian city militias with crossbows crushed Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's army. The crossbow's impact was vast. First, it empowered cities. Urban militias armed with crossbows, as in Genoa, which produced thousands, repelled feudal lords, fueling the rise of Italian communes like Florence or Milan that fought for autonomy. Second, it cracked the knights' monopoly on war. Knights remained vital, but their invincibility faded. By the 14th century, plate armor evolved, but steel crossbows pierced it too. Third, it birthed new tactics. Crossbowmen were paired with infantry and cavalry, as in 15th century Swiss armies, with pavises as standard protection. Fourth, it shifted war's culture. Chivalric romance dimmed. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart called crossbowmen base for killing from shadows, but praised their power. In literature, like Robin Hood tales, the longbow was honest compared to the crossbow, but reality cared little for such distinctions. The death of Richard the Lionheart in 1199, felled by a commoner's bolt during the siege of Chalais, was a stark symbol of change. The legendary king, hero of ballads, died not in a noble duel, but from a single shot. Another example. At Higueruela in 1431, Spanish crossbowmen devastated Moors, showcasing the weapon's might. At Hastings in 1066, Normans may have used crossbows, though evidence is debated, but by the 12th century, they were everywhere. The crossbow waned from the 15th century as arquebuses and cannons, faster, stronger, cheaper in mass production, took over. Yet it lingered in hunting until the 18th century and lives on in sports and reenactments. Its legacy lies in the changes it wrought, empowering the powerless, weakening feudal lords, elevating cities. It showed that even in a world of fixed roles, one technology could topple the pyramid. The church called it diabolical, but it was unstoppable. That's why the crossbow remains etched in history as the weapon that reshaped Europe.